Welcome to Voyage, the first podcast on crypto's real-world use cases, where you can also discover crypto's global impact one region at a time. Bon voyage!
We have some of the highest Gini coefficients, globally speaking, meaning really high inequity throughout the country. The haves and the have-nots. There's a massive gap there. Low educational rates, high illiteracy rates, low access to healthcare, really poor governance systems. Some of the most corrupt governments are in Latin America, right? Low trust in democracy, low access to highly technical services, like low GDP per capita, like all of these things that just simply are not beneficial for society moving forward. If Latin America has a really high product market fit for crypto, then why are we not seeing more adoption of this technology? I think there's a number of signs that point to mass adoption.
Hi, Kush. Welcome to Voyage. I'm really happy to have you here. I know LATAM has been, one of the hottest region in our industry for the past years. LATAM has a very special place in the world because Spanish, of course, is the second most used language in the world. And just from my experience, I think people that I've met that's from the region are all very open-minded. They're curious of learning new things. So I know, Kush, you grew up in Latin America. You are building in the Web3 space. And I actually came across your article before on the overview of LATAM, the product market fit and opportunities. It was very insightful. For people that wanted to understand this region, not just the Web3, but really understand what's going on in the society and how did crypto adoption become huge in the region. Like that being said, really happy to have you here to learn more about the region and also your personal background as well. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself first? How did you get into crypto and what are you working on right now?
Well, firstly, Jojo, it's really great to be here and excited for Voyage and what you're building out. So I go by Kush. Some people know me by another name. Depends on where we've met and at what point in the timeline. But I was, as you mentioned, born and raised here in Latin America and have had the sort of great fortune to have also lived and studied and worked and traveled a bit all over the place. So I think I sort of laid that as the foundation for a lot of the thesis for my life and the work that I do on a day-to-day basis is basically I see myself as a bridge from Latin America to much of the rest of the world, really. So how did I get into crypto? I used to spend an inordinate amount of time on Twitter way back when, and I was living in the United States at the time, and I couldn't do any work because of some visa restrictions. So I started doing a lot of engagement on Twitter and sort of started to figure out, hey, what's going on in this? Like I was, sort of a young teenager at the time and really wanted to understand sort of what was going on in the internet and different ways of making money that weren't beholden to one's geography. And but back in 2013 is when I came across Bitcoin. And again, as sort of like a young teenager, I thought, okay, this is like kind of weird. Why is this Bitcoin thing worth $80? I don't really totally understand this. But that was the first time I came across Bitcoin. It was over a decade ago. And I thought it was, as interesting as one can find this technology when you're 14 years old. I perhaps didn't have the sort of enlightenment that Vitalik might have had at the time. But I still it really piqued my interest, started kind of diving into the space a little bit. And then, I think from there, I just started weaving in and out of the ecosystem, really. So started seeing, okay, a few years later, Ethereum rolls around. I thought, okay, this is really fascinating. Again, took a deep dive into the world and then, kind of came out of it. And so it's been really like a decade of just playing and dancing with the crypto ecosystem. I think like my big life thesis is, how do we advance economies, leveraging all sorts of innovation, right? Like I think crypto is one part of what we do, but there are so many other verticals. And so I think that's why it was never like a full, 10 years ago, like full deep dive solely into crypto, but also was really interested in fintech and health tech and ed tech and all these other technology verticals. So it's been a super long career and trajectory with crypto and something I've really enjoyed. I think what that has allowed me to do is kind of get this really meta level perspective on the development of the technology and how the space has matured and so on.
Awesome. And what are you working on right now? Or what are your passion at the moment?
Yeah, so we are working on Odyssey or Odisea in Spanish. And Odyssey is an innovation lab, right? And so the thesis is that Latin America has a really high PMF for technology writ large, right? Again, it's not just crypto, it's AI, it's quantum, biotech, ag tech, among all of these other kind of technology verticals. Crypto is where we're starting right now because there's a number of different facets within that. But the way we see it is this is a technology that sort of just like affects all of these other verticals, sort of at a really kind of meta level base layer foundation, right? And so Odyssey, basically what we try to do is we say, if Latin America has a really high product market fit for crypto, then why are we not seeing more adoption of this technology? Why do we not have, our entire financial system running on these rails? Why isn't our governance system built on top of distributed systems? Why aren't, national ledgers, budgets on public ledgers, for example, where we can all verify this, right? And I think it's important to maybe like take a step back so the audience that perhaps isn't quite as familiar with Latin America gets a sense of why I'm saying there's a high PMF, right? So Latin America comes from in fact, it was Columbus Day a couple days ago in the US. And in the 1400s, when Christopher Columbus comes to the Americas and ends up establishing a lot of the Spanish kind of colonial rule over and I'm not going to go into the kind of a whole history of colonialism here, but what ends up happening is we end up kind of entering hundreds of years worth of colonial rule and end up inheriting a lot of bureaucracy, which Spain is infamous for, right? And then when the Spanish end up leaving, we basically end up with this like really unequal society that just continues to propagate and be very present throughout much of Latin America, right? So what does that look like in today's day and age? We have some of the highest Gini coefficients, globally speaking, meaning, really high inequity throughout the country, the haves and the have-nots, there's a massive gap there. Low educational rates, high illiteracy rates, low access to healthcare, really poor governance system. Some of the most corrupt governments are in Latin America, right? Low trust in democracy, low access to highly technical services, like low GDP per capita, like all of these things that just simply are not beneficial for society moving forward, right? And so in order to transform these systems, we need to catalyze large-scale change. The question is, how do we do that, right? And any change like requires some sort of energy input. And the beautiful thing about technology is it allows you to like change and transform a system with less energy input than without that technology being in place, right? It's like the difference between walking somewhere versus driving, right? It's like the energy input is just like lower and the time is much faster, right? And so that's where we see technology basically playing a key role in transforming Latin America. It's like if we want to sort of change the way that these societies operate and function, then we can really use technology as a strong lever to accelerate the way that development happens, right? So that's where Odyssey comes in. Again, it goes back to what I started off with, is like we're basically a bridge between a lot of the technology that's being developed in the global north, the Europe and the US, and implementing it, developing it, and adopting it in Latin America. So we do three things at Odyssey, right? We try to produce a lot of research and insights on the state of adoption, which I think is like what a lot of people know us for. You can check out our blog, words.odyssey.xyz. Again, it's spelled in Spanish. And we just produce a lot of open source research on like, hey, what's going on in Latin America? Because a lot of people don't even know, right? They're like, why should I care about this region? So that's the first thing we do. The second thing we do is we do what we call catalyzing, where basically we work with a lot of leading kind of global crypto protocols and foundations, and also outside of the crypto world, but I'll just focus on this for the sake of this podcast. And they say, hey, we want to be more present in Latin America. Can you help us figure that out, right? And so we do that by helping them tap into developer ecosystems, helping them tap into regulatory, like figure out regulation and how they should be engaging with regulators in the region. We do that by doing a lot of kind of very highly targeted like research and UX projects where we're like, hey, how can we tropicalize this product? How can this product have more of a stronghold in the region, for example, right? And so there's a number of different approaches that we have and how we bring these global companies into Latin America. The third thing we do is we accelerate teams, right? So we support LATAM-based founders in bringing their products to market. How can they raise capital? Who are the people they should be leveraging to tap into their advisory boards, for example? Who's really going to be kind of high value add, navigating the whole fundraising journey and so on, right? And then the last piece is we're setting up decentralized infrastructure in order to bring more geographic distribution to a lot of nodes that are operating in the crypto ecosystem. So those are the four things that we do. It's quite a lot, but I think it's like we try to take a very full approach to the way we see this, right? It's not like there isn't just any one thing that's going to be really effective in the region. It's got to be a very holistic approach. And yeah, we love what we do. It's really fun and just allows us to think at a very foundational level on, okay, if this technology is really important, how do we bring more of it to the region?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, thank you guys for doing that. When I was talking to a lot of builders in Latin America, I asked them, what are we lacking for this, for the normal Joes to come and join the crypto world? And a lot of them told me that education is still a big part of it because I think just like from the history of crypto, a lot of people still have a really bad impression. They think, a lot of people still think it's a scam. So really really putting the educational effort out and then tell people, hey, this is not a scam, it's just bad actors, and then you can really do a lot of things with this technology. I think that's very important as well. And one question I have on the LATAM market is, so you've mentioned the history and there's a lot of, corrupted government, there's a lot of inequities. Is there a general distrust between the people and the government in the Latin America region?
Yeah, so huge distrust in government, right? And whether that's a consequence of high inflation or questioning the extent to which like elections are valid, as we've seen, high inflation in Argentina, right? I mean, but there's high inflation throughout much of the region. Distrust in governments is a consequence of corruption. Venezuela, most recently, right? Like really contested election outcomes, whereby, a certain candidate basically said, we won the election. And the other candidate said, no, you didn't. And again, there was sort of, even to this day, just like really high degree of questioning of like who did actually win that election. And there's huge things sort of on the line there for a country like Venezuela. So pair that with a very diverse country, sort of region, right? It's like I think one of the things that works really well, say about like Nordic countries, is everyone kind of looks the same and has the same set of values and, has a premise of like, hey, we're all in this together. Latin America has a really high diversity of populations, right? I mean, in some countries like Guatemala, there are literally dozens of languages that are spoken in the country. So how can we create like this like common shelling point and coordination mechanism that is built upon the nation state when like the people don't even speak the same language that the Constitution is written in, right? So I think that there's just like a lot of different factors that make this a really unique region for having high distrust in governments.
Yeah, definitely. And in your article, I remember you mentioned that this is probably a result of history, but Latin America actually has one of the youngest population around the world, which is a really positive factor. What are some of the popular things among young people nowadays in Latin America? So in terms of like industries, so when they graduate from college, or what are some of the sectors or industries they're mostly interested in?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. While we do have really the only time that it's like valuable, quote unquote, to have like a young population is if it's like highly educated, right?
Yeah.
So while we have really a very young population, they're also relatively uneducated. So even like the question of like, what do people think about when they go to like after college? It's like not a lot of people end up going to college. So it oftentimes isn't even this like, oh, I'm keen to like go into this field or that field. I mean, I think the interesting like trend here is like we have a fairly uneducated population that is young. Things that I notice is that a lot of these kids, whether it's like a woman's child begging on the street or, even someone who's in a much more privileged position, like things I've seen that I think are really fascinating is like they're always like on their phone, right? They're like playing some game or they're watching a YouTube video. And that to me, and again, I think it's one of the things that's really unique about Latin America is really high penetration of mobile phones, right? I saw a statistic somewhere, and I don't know the extent to which it's true, right? But it said that there's more mobile phones than like toilets in Latin America. And so if the premise is true, then it's like, okay, well, what can we deliver via a mobile phone to someone in the region, right? It's like, and if you don't have access to say going to school, like what can you learn by a YouTube video? Or how can you, instead of like having to go to a bank and figure out, how you can access this super archaic like financial system that probably isn't going to lend you any money, like could we give you better banking and financial services through a mobile phone? Like that's the stuff that I think is really fascinating. And I think a trend that, I think a lot of people are trying to explore. The problem there always from a venture backable, like scalable business is like the lifetime value of these customers tends to be generally quite low compared to say like an American middle class like person, right? So sort of a bit of
Yeah.
a barrier there. But I think that's an interesting trend with younger folks in the region.
A little bit deeper dive into crypto. So you mentioned there's a lot of distrust between the people in government, and also um, a lot of governments are just not really doing the right thing. But I guess from someone that's not from the region, I've seen a lot of great news from how some of the Latin America governments are actually very proactive in terms of like technology, regulating crypto or accepting crypto. So for example, like El Salvador with Bitcoin and stuff. So while government is trying out this innovating stuff, what are the people's or like the normal folks in Latin America? What are their general perception of crypto right now?
I think it's generally pretty optimistic. Like I think that a lot of people got burned in the US and Africa and Europe by FTX. A lot of people like primarily use Binance here. That's the primary engagement, and like for people, crypto means Binance, right? There's some countries where like you ask people what the internet is, and like it's Facebook, And I think that's like very analogous to what crypto means here. It's like, hey, what's crypto? Oh, Binance. So I think Binance has done a really a job of entering the region. Obviously, there's like a ton of problems around, not your keys, not your crypto, and so generally though, and that one of the really interesting things about Latin America is like you can't. It's hard to be like, oh, the same thing in Mexico, same thing as Brazil, and the same thing in Colombia and like Argentina. Like each one of these is totally different markets. In some cases, totally different languages.
Mm.
So in Argentina, crypto seems generally pretty favorably, right? Is because it's super easy to, or easier than going through the trad system to convert your pesos, Argentine pesos, which, in some cases are inflating like 100% on an annual basis, into USDT or whatever sort of stable asset, or maybe you want to go into Bitcoin or Ethereum, right? So like in Argentina, super high sort of like favorable engagement. I think it's yeah, I mean, in Mexico and some of these other smaller markets, it's not quite as much, but still really interesting and exciting. El Salvador is an interesting one, right? Because Bitcoin, it's the first country where Bitcoin's legal tender. I mean, that's huge. That is genuinely massive. They have really pro like crypto laws. They have generally just like very, very open regulatory landscape with Nayib Bukele, who's in power now, right? Um, and so there it's like, okay, yeah, we know about Bitcoin, but when you go, it's like how many people actually use it. I was just there last week, and it's not as many as one might think. Like some places accept Bitcoin, but it's not everywhere.
Hmm.
And also just like Bitcoin's such a horrible way of sending money, to be honest, that I'd much rather see these things happen with stables, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
that's one thing that I would say.
Got it. Got it. So, in your opinion or from your experience, what are some of the roadblocks, or why haven't we seen more user coming in into the crypto space, or what are the difficulties onboarding people or for user adoptions in Latin America?
I think as you said, it's like one, it starts with education.
Hmm.
So how do we create like more general knowledge and like awareness of like what crypto is, right? I think that that is just fundamental, like base layer understanding. I think the other piece is utility too. I think for crypto in its current state, I mean I think like DeFi for example, there's this whole debate of like, oh, is DeFi like good for crypto or is it not, or should we focus on these other things? Blah, blah. It's like for me, DeFi is such an exciting use case, and I did a little experiment. I wrote a whole blog and I published a video on
Mm.
it, and I basically went into, and this is to the utility point. I went into a bank branch and I was like, hey, I want to buy a car. Can I get a loan? And it was like a multi like day long thing, and I had to wait and queue in line, blah, blah. And at the end of the day, like I calculated sort of the interest rate over the course of 4 years, and it ended up being, it was like on an annual basis, the interest rate was about 20%, and I did this whole math, and then I went and I actually ended up taking a loan out with Liquidity, right? Which is a
Mm.
DeFi protocol on Ethereum mainnet. They've got 0.5% like flat interest rate, and they like to say 0% interest rate, but it's actually 0.5 because when you actually ask for the loan, there's that fee, and there might be a platform fee. Anyways, point is like a super low interest rate loan utilizing DeFi. And I calculated the payments over the course of 4 years, and it was about an order of magnitude cheaper to take out a loan on DeFi than it is with TradFi.
Yeah.
The problem is like DeFi in its current state is very it's immature, right? It's like it's all over collateralized loans, and so it's like, hey, for someone to have the foresight to be like, if I have $1,000 in ETH and I want to buy something that's worth $500, why would I put $1,000 into a protocol, then borrow $1,000 of ETH into a protocol, then borrow 500 and buy the thing instead of just like selling half the asset and just buying the thing, and then I have to do with all these complicated things, right? Because there's like sort of some financial literacy that is smaller than that, and like over time you expect $1,000 to become $2,000, right? For example. So, I think that there's like that, and it just jumping back, right, is like educational literacy regarding finance and general use cases of crypto, and utility just more broadly. I think it's like interesting because I think meme coins, for example, the value there is like a casino, right? Is like number go up technology, maybe. I haven't really seen meme coins take off in a massive way in the region. I think in the way maybe it has in like the US and Europe. Again, I think it's just because people are like, why the heck would I burn like, my money on this thing, without thinking like, oh, maybe there's like financial upside here for me. Interestingly, like I've seen it take it off quite a lot in Africa, and there's like a couple of like interesting things there. I think there is a fair degree of regulatory uncertainty in the region as well, right? Latin America, by and large, tends to follow like whatever the U.S. does and says. It's like, oh, we build out our policy because of history, right? Is we're like, oh yeah, like the United States and the SEC is saying do this, and we'll like just do it without even thinking about it. So that's obviously an undesired outcome. And then I think there's just like general like onboarding questions, right? Is like, do you use MetaMask? Do you use Coinbase Wallet? Is Coinbase Wallet available in your region? Like gas, blah, blah, blah. It's like, again, user experience needs to be totally abstracted away. And that's what I like about Infinex, for example, if you're familiar. Yeah. So I think Infinex is like, I would love to see a new bank, which is Latin America's fastest growing fintech bank. New bank X Infinex in Latin America. Product idea for anyone listening. But yeah, I think those are a few. Exactly. That's kind of like a few different points that I would touch on.
Got it. A very random question, just out of curiosity. On meme coins, you said it haven't really taken off in Latin America. I was recording an episode with someone from Thailand, a great build from Thailand, and he said actually like Thai people are really, really into gambling, which I was really surprised. And also, people from China and Korea, they're so into gambling as well. Is gambling or like kind of like risking your life savings and just to like ape into something, is that like in the culture of Latin American people at all?
I think it's hard to generalize, right? Like I've heard of some countries where gambling is like the thing, and people just like love it. And I've heard of other countries where not at all the case. But what I will say is I think what's interesting about Thailand or Korea is like there's generally higher degrees of like financial literacy. I think gambling is somewhat of a, like when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Is like if you can't read or write or eat, gambling isn't going to be top of mind for you. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's like super prevalent as say like I know Korea, for example, is like a huge market when it comes to gambling and crypto generally, right? So again, it's just like it's sort of like a chicken and egg thing where we need to catalyze more adoption of this technology to create more economic prosperity so that we bring more people on board. And so that's the cycle that we're currently in at the moment.
Got it. And then, so you kind of mentioned some of the use cases you've seen so far, right? So for example, you did a testing yourself using DeFi protocols on lending. Are there any interesting use cases you've seen lately in crypto in Latin America?
Like use cases that people are actually building, or theoretically like use cases that I think would be great?
I think maybe what people are actually building right now.
Okay. So I've seen a number, like I think local stablecoins has been really interesting. Like stablecoins are taking off, right? It's like one of crypto's best use cases is being able to send money globally, generally denominated in US dollars. And I've seen like that be a huge hit in just globally, right? And then I see a lot of builders be like, hey, I want to issue Colombian pesos or Argentine pesos or Mexican pesos or Guatemalan quetzales or lempiras, just like all these local assets. I've seen people really be very excited about issuing them. And they're forking DAI and they're forking all these other CDPs in order to issue the assets. That has been exciting. Again, it's like how many people want to play with a distributed, decentralized peso, right? Like Mexico, for example, with their reales, or sorry, Brazil with their reales, they have PIX, which is sort of this payment rail. They're looking at a CDBC as well. So there's like I think generally like payments on stable coins is going to be big. The other use case that I have seen some people playing with, but I think we need to see a lot more of is governance on chain for Latin America. Like that is huge. I mean, honestly, huge. And within that comes digital identity. So Buenos Aires, for example, has Cork ID, which is runs on ZK. Yep, you've probably heard about it. It's like one of the bigger experiments where literally like over 1 million people got issued this like Cork ID in the city of Buenos Aires. And behind the scenes is like ZK technology that's all completely abstracted away. That's huge. That is massive. Like government identities that leverage crypto makes so much sense. So that's another really interesting use case. And it's like, oh, why don't we embed like governance systems into this, right? It's like in Estonia, for example, you can vote like online. More than half, 56%, if I'm not mistaken, of their votes come digitally, right? It's like, oh, cool. I would love to vote online too, right? Instead of having to stand for hours and hours. So that's a great use case that I have really liked. Gaming, I'm not like, I don't love gaming just because I think it just sucks you into like the digital worlds. And I think if anything, it's like we need to spend more time touching grass. But gaming for sure is like super popular, and people love it. Off Grid, right, is a game that's taking off right now, built on Avalanche. That is a game that I've seen be really successful in the global north, and it's like, okay, people are playing lots of games in Latin America. How do we get you to like play and earn, as we've seen already happen in a meaningful way in Southeast Asia, for example, right? Empowering artists, I've seen a lot of people building on that, right? So it's like, how do we build marketplaces so that artists get paid more fairly, right? There's a lot of arbitrage that comes with, people selling like merchandise or products from Latin America and the global north, and, a huge profit margin that comes from that never ends up getting to the local artist. I think that like, how could we connect local artisans with global consumers, I think is another really interesting and exciting use case. Haven't really seen anyone do it in a big way. Things that I would like to see more of are edtech like learn to earn platforms. Duolingo, for example, was started by Guatemalan, and you get like Duolingo points as you progress through the platform. It's like, yeah, what if like you could cash that out into something, right? Like that would be really cool if you would actually like there was some sort of money that you actually get there. That would be amazing. Again, like more governance systems, like more voting systems on chain, I think is 100% needed. And then I think there's so many opportunities for DeFi in the region. The problem is, again, it's like not really like venture backable and scalable, but like so many little experiments that you could play with. There's like saving circles that I've seen people build, where you just like get into a local cooperative. You're like, hey, let's all use like crypto rails to save money together. That's super exciting. So those are a few projects that I'd like to see more of.
Got it. Thanks for sharing that. Definitely think like Duolingo is a good example because I was using that to learn Spanish. Well, I'm really bad at it, but I think it's definitely addicting, and it's a good way to kind of hook people, and of course doing things that will be helpful to them. So speaking of building in Latin America, I know you mentioned before that even for Latin America there's a lot of diversity, many different languages. Many different languages, consumer behavior is different, history is different. So the localization is very important when building. Are there any other things in terms of culture, custom, or go-to-market strategies that people need to be aware of when they come to build in Latin America?
Oh my gosh, so many things, right? It's not just like you can't just copy paste like your strategy, right? can't be like, oh, we're gonna reach people in Latin America on Warpcast. No, that's not gonna work. So yeah, I mean, just like you mentioned language, right? It's like the even words that are used in, even if you speak the same language, which Spanish, the words that are used in Chile and in Uruguay and in El Salvador are going to be in many cases very different. You'll be able to like understand each other, but there's like these nuances, right? Of like how do you say like done, or how do you say send money, or how do you say thank you, right? Like these like very small nuances that can tell you like this app was developed in Spain, this app was developed in Mexico, right? And generally, like if you want to create a really sticky like relationship with your customer, you want to make sure that the app feels as homey to you as possible, right? So one, there's like the language, and it's not just like, oh yeah, we'll just do it in Spanish. No, you can't just do it in Spanish because there's so many different Spanishes that are spoken, right? So I think that's like one important consideration that teams need to have is how are you tropicalizing the your interface with according to a user's location. How you engage with community and community building is very different as well, right? It's like a lot of communities run on WhatsApp, you know. I
Okay.
know people who never use WhatsApp. I'm like this. I use WhatsApp all the time. Yeah, you just probably use like iMessage and Telegram, right? And like
Yeah.
maybe some other platform. WhatsApp is literally people run entire businesses on WhatsApp.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so it's like, okay, are you gonna build your community out on WhatsApp? Okay, cool. Like then
Mm.
you should think about how you want to do that. When we think about KOLs, key opinion leaders, is like KOLs in Latin America speak a different language, and they're totally different from KOLs in Europe and North America, right? And so I think it's like those are some key considerations. There's like generally a high degree of skepticism when it comes to like money related initiatives. Like people will
Okay.
store their money under their sheets or in like gold rings or jewelry or whatever. And so I think also thinking about okay where, yeah, especially specifically if you're building like a financial platform, how can you build a really high trust relationship with people, right? And like how can you, so your CAC, customer acquisition cost ends up being much higher perhaps if
Yeah.
you aren't being very strategic about how you're entering the region.
Yeah. I remember when I was chatting with Lalo last time, he mentioned that cash based economy is huge in Latin America. Like people would rather use cash or have cash instead of even having a bank account or, if a credit card or something. And then if we think about like DeFi, it's even another level of complexity. So yeah, definitely. And also you mentioned, like KOLs, influencers is very, important in Latin America. Are there any other, I guess, like when it comes to marketing or promotion of anything you're building in Latin America? I know KOL is one of the things. Are there any other things that people need to be aware of when, in terms of like really promoting your apps or marketing campaigns in the region?
Yeah, I think it's you know, not you don't need to reinvent the playbook, right? Like we've already seen like Web2 companies really, really take off in the region, right? And so whether that's Rappi, Mercado Libre,
Yeah.
InDriver, like all of these Latin American Web2 unicorns have done really, really great jobs. I am a big fan of incentives when it comes to referrals, for example, right? It's like, hey, and this goes back kind of like to the CAC point is the incentive, like dollar basis per customer that you're going to target, like generally will be lower for a Latin American user than it will be for an American user. Obviously, like the value that like each of these users brings is very different, but you can run an incentives campaign on like a much lower value for your user at the end of the day, which means like referral programs I think are really interesting and just like hit it off like wildfire. I think that's another really key mechanism. Again, I think it's like community engagement and people feeling like, oh, there's someone here that I can reach out to, who I can
Okay.
trust, and establishing that like close relationship with people, I think is super important. Like, oh yeah, I have my crypto guy on speed dial, and they're like,
Mm.
if something goes wrong, like I can call them, right? Because we're just used to things going wrong and like really poor customer service. Here's another business idea for the listeners of the podcast. Like, come to Latin America and build a business where customer service works. And like what you say you're going to do, you actually do it. Crazy,
Uh,
crazy idea. Because like oftentimes, you get promised one thing and you get delivered another thing. And it's just like ridiculous, right? So I think that that's like another just key consideration too.
got it. Got it. So you need someone on the ground if you're building anything, right? It's not like maybe in the Western world, you can literally just start a business promoting everything online. You don't even need anything physical. But
Yeah,
in terms of, building in Latin America, people need to see, they need to touch it or know that there's something there that I can reach out to. Yeah,
exactly.
that's very different. And yeah, that's something that's really good to know for people that are building the space too. I guess my last question is, I know a lot of people, and of course yourself, is very, very bullish on Latin American markets. Is there any sign of mass adoption happening in the region that you can think of right now?
I mean, I think there's a number of signs that point to mass adoption. So I'll start with the builders front and then I'll go into the retail front, right? So like on the builders front, we've seen really, really like top tier projects come from Latin America. Like even Brian Armstrong, when he talks about Coinbase, right?
Mm.
He either took a gap year or I think he just finished like working at Airbnb. At some point in his like before founding Coinbase, he was in Buenos Aires and he noticed how
Oh,
bad inflation was. And he was like, "Oh, this sucks." And I think that's where he first came across Bitcoin was in Buenos Aires, or his experience there was super formative, right? And so we've seen like some of the biggest like crypto companies sort of be seated in the region, or some of the core contributors come from the region as well, right? So like practical examples of this, Maker, for example, a lot of the development work for Maker was done in Argentina. We've got Hard Hat that was founded by Argentinians, Flashbots, a lot of Argentine Latin American contributors. You were at Scroll previously, right? Like a lot of Latin American contributors at
yeah,
Scroll.
yeah.
We've got Bello, Ripio, Nubank, Aave, POAP, like all these teams why they're founded by or had core contributors that were from the region, right? So that's like the builders front. There's sort of an estimate of over 1,000 crypto developers in Latin America, right? Which is like fairly decent considering like how few crypto developers there are generally. And then there's over 100 developer communities as well, right? So like on the builders front, there's a lot of builders in the region. That's really what I love to focus on is like how do we access and sort of support these builders primarily. And then on the retail front, right, I mentioned like high PMF, nearly half the population is unbanked,
Mm.
billions of dollars in remittance flows. In some countries, Guatemala, for example, like 18% of the country's GDP comes from remittance flows. Huge, right? Like one fifth of the country's GDP is remittance flows, like on the order of billions of dollars, right? And then on the retail front, as far as adoption of crypto goes, there's like a number of different estimates, right? But we have generally like countries with pretty decently good like crypto regulatory adoption, right? So whether that is
Mhm.
El Salvador, Argentina is moving towards this. Uruguay generally tends to have like decent regulatory sort of engagement. Brazil is exploring a lot of CBDC related and build on crypto rail kind of work. Um, and then we have millions and millions of users throughout Latin America as well. We've seen an annual growth rate of 2x in usage of crypto protocols. And then we have some of the highest SEX usage globally as well. So, really high penetration of centralized exchanges throughout the region. Again, a lot of this comes from Binance. So, it's like there's huge PMF, lots of builder energy going on right now at the moment and just super exciting.
Yeah, that sounds actually very exciting and bullish. But for people like myself, I'm not from Latin America, but I'm really interested in the market, or like any builders that are looking to the market, where should they start when they want to explore the market?
Mhm.
Like, where would you recommend them to start?
I am so biased, right? But like, I mean, I genuinely think it's like a really good source of information is our blog. So words.odyssey.xyz. We've got
Yeah, I agree. It's really good.
a lot of content on there, like a lot of research that we published on developer adoption, on use cases for crypto, like lots of interviews that we've done with people. Literally a lot of knowledge on there. I think it's like one of the better like knowledge hubs that we've managed to compile. And then there's a lot of like smaller communities that you can tap into as well. You mentioned Lalo, for example, they're doing great work with Espacio Crypto. That's like mainly Spanish content. But again, it's like our role is like we want to be a bridge for people that are maybe listening to this podcast. So like, hey, how can I learn more about this crypto Latin America thing, right? There are a number of reports that have been published. Bitso published a report recently on the state of adoption of crypto in Latin America. Bitso is one of the biggest centralized exchanges in Mexico, for example. They published a report very recently on crypto adoption in the region. The Crypto Adoption Index by Chainalysis like kind of walks through regionally like how people are using crypto and percentage rates. I've heard some questions on like the extent to which like the research is totally accurate. It's always hard when you're trying to do this because like a lot of the data is closed off. But that's another like interesting outlet for people for sure.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much for all the sharings. I think it's really, really insightful. I would also look into the things that you've shared before. And I think the blog that Odyssey have is actually really useful. Just for me, like reading your article, I think I had a good understanding of the broader ecosystem of Latin America. Yeah, that's actually all my questions. Thank you so much for sharing everything, and thank you so much for your time. Yeah, this is outside of the question list, but just wondering if you have seen any, I guess, like miserable failure that builders have done in the space. Just, I guess, lessons people should learn.
Oh man, we work with like dozens of builders throughout the region and like in theory some of the best, right?
Yeah.
Um, I mentioned there's this like this huge cultural barrier, right? Where people are
Mm,
like business is very informal here, right? It's like your
uh,
cousin or a really good friend and you hit them up, you're like, "Hey, what's up? Like Juanito, I was wondering, could you do this favor for me?" And like, "Yeah, dude, I got you." And sometimes the expectation is like that translates over to the rest of the world. And so they'll be
uh,
like, "Hey man, like can you put me in touch with so and so like investor or like this ecosystem?" And I'm like, "Well, what do you want?" They're like, "I just want to chat." I'm like,
mm,
that's not how it works, man.
yeah,
They're not, if you want to tap into like a top tier VC, it's like, and if as an example, right, I'm like, "How much are you raising?" Like, "We don't know. We just want to like have a conversation."
yeah,
And have you figured out, like the structure of the raise? And like, nope. But we just want to chat. I'm like, okay, I'm really sorry, but like that's just
doesn't work like
not going
that.
to go well for you. So I'm going to save everyone the pain. The investor, like the kind of just like experience, you, the feedback, me, like the slack for putting these people together. So I think that's like one thing that people from Latin America generally just need to be more conscious of is, hey, how do I interface with an American? How do I interface with a European?
Mm,
Because it's going to be very different than what it is elsewhere. I mean, we've been shouting from the rooftops for years, like, "Hey guys, Latin America is super exciting. You need to be in here." So it's genuinely like a consequence of there being surplus capital at the moment, and so I can tell you, like, having done this through two bull runs now and a bear,
mm,
it's like, hey, like the bear, it was like Latin America, what, and now that things are just like in a much more
yeah,
abundant place. You're like, "Hey, Latin America, what's up, man? We should talk again." And so, obviously, like, great to see that, but also, how do we avoid like these cyclical
mm,
pitfalls where it's like exciting for like a couple of years, not exciting for 2 years, exciting for 2 years, so I think that's one thing that we've also been thinking a lot about too, and how do we kind of create a long-term sustainability like engagement for us to keep this going
yeah.
for many, many, many years.
Yeah, it's definitely a long-term game. But I've seen a lot of events happening, a huge event happening in LATAM, right? There's not just ETH LATAM, but then also, what was the conference that was, it's like a pop-up city kind of thing?
Crecimiento, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that was huge, right? And then
Yep. Avalanche
there's,
Summit is happening right now.
yeah, 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 Avalanche Summit. And then also there's Solana Economic Zone, which I thought
Yep,
was pretty
Forma.
interesting. Yeah, Forma. So there's so much happening. I mean, I'm glad to see it.
Definitely. Well, this has been awesome, Jojo. Really, really great chatting with you. And I appreciate you delving into these other regions as well. So I'm excited to hear more of the upcoming shows too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for coming on the show and talk about LATAM for me, to me for an hour.